In 1917 in Torrance, California, a baby boy was born to an Italian immigrant family. His name was Louis Silvi Zamperini. But from his earliest years, little Louis was different. He was wild, untamed, and impossible to control. As a child, Louis was climbing fences, stealing food, and getting into fights. His parents struggled to understand where this energy came from. Nothing seemed to work. Louis was a tornado in human form. By his early teens, Louis had become well known to the local police. He stole from stores, he vandalized property. He seemed destined for prison or worse. But Louis had an older brother named Pete. Pete was everything Louis was not: responsible, calm, thoughtful. While the rest of the world saw Louis as a delinquent, Pete saw something else. He saw unlimited potential. Pete refused to give up on Louis. One day, Pete had an idea. The local high school had a track team. Pete knew that Louis was fast. What if that speed could be put to use on a legitimate track? What if they could transform Louis's restless energy into athletic achievement? Pete convinced his reluctant younger brother to try out for the team. At first, Louis resisted, but Pete was persistent. Eventually, Louis agreed. It was a decision that would change everything. When Louis first stepped onto the track at Torrance High School, something awakened in him. For the first time in his life, he found something that made sense. On the track, his wild energy wasn't a liability. It was an asset. Louis threw himself into running with incredible intensity. He trained obsessively. He ran before school. He ran after school. He ran on weekends. His coach watched in amazement. This former troublemaker was transforming into a serious athlete. The delinquent became a champion. By his senior year, Louis was breaking records. He was the fastest distance runner in the area. College scouts began to take notice. The University of Southern California offered him a scholarship. At 18 years old, Louis Zamperini was on his way. At USC, Louis trained under legendary coach Dean Cromwell. Cromwell recognized immediately that Louis had something special. Not just speed, but an almost supernatural ability to endure pain. More than that, Louis had hunger. He had something to prove. The coach became a mentor figure. During his college years, Louis became one of the fastest distance runners in the entire country. He set records, he won competitions. But there was one goal that obsessed him above all others: the Olympic Games. In 1936, when Louis was just 20 years old, he set his sights on the U.S. Olympic team. The Olympics that year would be held in Berlin, Germany. They would be presided over by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. For Louis, none of that mattered. The Olympics were the pinnacle of athletic achievement. He was determined to compete. Louis trained harder than he had ever trained. He pushed his body to its limits. He visualized crossing finish lines. His effort paid off. He made the U.S. Olympic team. In the summer of 1936, Louis traveled to Berlin. He was just a 22-year-old kid from California. But he was about to run on one of the world's greatest stages. When he stepped into the Olympic Stadium, he could feel the weight of history. Hitler sat in his box. The crowds were enormous. The pressure was immense. Louis ran the 5,000-meter race. He didn't win. A Finnish runner took the gold. But Louis ran with heart and determination. He represented his country with pride. He crossed that finish line as an Olympian. He had competed on the world's greatest stage. When Louis returned to America, he was celebrated. Newspapers wrote about him. He appeared in newsreels. He had achieved the dream of millions. He was only 22 years old. His entire life seemed to stretch ahead. Surely people thought this was just the beginning. Surely greater victories awaited him. But fate had other plans. For a few years after the Olympics, Louis continued to compete. But the world was changing. Dark clouds were gathering over Europe and Asia. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. Young men, including athletes and Olympians, were called to serve. Louis enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942. He wanted to fight for his country. He wanted to do his part in the war effort. Instead of running on tracks, he would now fly in bombers. His position would be bombardier. He would be responsible for aiming and releasing bombs. Louis was assigned to a B-24 Liberator bomber. The crew of 11 men flew dangerous missions. They bombed Japanese targets across thousands of miles of ocean. Each mission was a gamble with death. Japanese fighters would attack. Anti-aircraft fire would explode around the plane. Engines would sometimes fail. Planes would catch fire or disappear. Louis flew mission after mission. He survived encounters that killed other airmen. By May 1943, he had completed 42 bombing runs. He had cheated death dozens of times. But then came May 27, 1943. Louis's plane was nicknamed the Green Hornet. It was flying a search and rescue mission, looking for a downed naval crew. The flight was supposed to be routine. But nothing about this day would be routine. Halfway through the flight, the plane's engines began to fail. One engine stopped, then another. The crew tried desperately to keep the damaged aircraft in the air, but it was hopeless. The pilot, Russell Phillips, knew they were going down. He had only moments to find a place to crash. There was nothing but ocean below. Ocean in every direction. Russell Phillips aimed the dying aircraft downward. The impact was violent. The plane hit the water hard. It broke apart and began to sink. Of the 11 men aboard, only 3 survived. First pilot Russell Phillips, gunner Francis McNamara, known as Mac, and bombardier Louis Zamperini. They managed to cling to 2 small inflatable life rafts. They were lashed together, creating a tiny floating platform in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. What began then was one of the most extraordinary survival stories in modern history. For 47 days, Louis, Russell, and Mac drifted on the Pacific Ocean. They had almost no supplies, no fresh water, a few emergency rations of food that quickly ran out, no way to signal for help. They were utterly, completely alone. The sun was merciless. During the day, it beat down on them with relentless intensity. There was no shade, no relief. Their skin burned and burned again. Their lips cracked and bled. Thirst became their greatest enemy, a thirst so intense it seemed to consume them from the inside out. The days blended together into a nightmarish haze. Rain came sometimes. They would frantically try to catch it in their mouths. They caught fish with their bare hands when they could. They ate raw fish for moisture and nutrition. But it also made them sick. One of them saw a bird. He actually thought about killing it to drink its blood, a sign of how desperate their situation had become. Then there were the sharks. The ocean around them seemed populated with them. Sharks circled their small raft, curious about these strange humans. The men would kick at the water, trying to scare them away, never knowing if the next moment would be their last. Louis faced his fear day after day, knowing that one mistake could end his life. But perhaps the greatest enemy was not sharks or thirst or hunger. It was the psychological strain. Endless ocean, endless sky, endless waiting, day after day with no sign of rescue, hour after hour wondering if anyone was looking for them. The human mind can only endure so much. Before it begins to crack, Mac the gunner began to suffer the most. He had been injured in the crash. His injuries weren't healing. Infection set in. His mind began to deteriorate. He became delirious, raving about things that weren't there. His body grew weaker. On the 33rd day adrift, Mac died. Louis and Russell were forced to push his body into the ocean. They were alone now, just 2 survivors clinging to life, on a tiny raft in an infinite ocean. But then on day 46, something miraculous happened. A plane appeared on the horizon. Louis and Russell began to signal frantically, waving their arms, using mirrors, doing everything they could to attract attention. Their rescue had finally come, but it hadn't. The plane was Japanese. As it came closer, they realized with horror what they thought would be their salvation was about to become something far worse. The Japanese plane began to strafe the raft with machine gun fire. Bullets tore through the rubber, creating holes. Louis and Russell dove into the water, swimming away as bullets churned the ocean around them. Somehow, impossibly, they survived the attack. But now they faced a new horror. A Japanese ship appeared on the horizon. It was heading toward them. Louis and Russell were about to be captured. On day 47, exhausted and starving, nearly dead, Louis and Russell were pulled from the water by Japanese sailors. They had survived 47 days at sea. They had cheated death repeatedly. But their ordeal was only beginning. Now they faced something that might prove even more terrible. Captivity under the Japanese military during wartime. Louis and Russell were taken aboard the Japanese ship. They were treated brutally from the start. The Japanese military had no love for American prisoners. They made that clear through violence and humiliation. But their situation was about to become even worse. The Japanese discovered who Louis was. They realized he was the American runner from the 1936 Berlin Olympics. To the Japanese military, this was significant. Louis was not just an American soldier. He was a symbol of American excellence and pride. The Japanese military decided something important. Breaking Louis Zamperini would be a symbolic victory. He became a special target for abuse and humiliation. Louis and Russell were transported to a series of Japanese POW camps. camps scattered across the Pacific. In these camps, prisoners were worked to exhaustion, given barely enough food to survive, subjected to constant brutal punishment. The guards seemed to take pleasure in the suffering. Prisoners died from disease, malnutrition, and violence. At one camp, Louis came under particular attention. A guard the prisoners called the Bird. The Bird was a sadistic man. He seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting Louis. He would beat Louis for minor infractions, for looking at him the wrong way, for moving too slowly, for simply existing. The Bird would force Louis to stand at attention for hours. In the blazing sun, he would make him carry heavy loads while beating him with a stick. It was systematic, calculated cruelty. Louis's body deteriorated. He lost weight at an alarming rate. By the time he was liberated, he would weigh only 90 pounds, down from his athletic weight of around 140 pounds. He was skeletal, weakened, and broken. But something in his mind refused to break completely. Throughout his captivity, Louis clung to memories. He thought about his family. He thought about running. He thought about home. He recited poetry to himself. He imagined conversations with loved ones. These mental exercises became his lifeline, keeping him tethered to his humanity, even as everything around him tried to strip that away. The other prisoners noticed Louis's strength. Even as he was being brutalized, even as his body was wasting away, Louis seemed to maintain an inner core of resistance. He didn't break, he didn't beg. He didn't lose his will to survive. For many of the other prisoners, Louis became an example, proof that the human spirit could endure almost anything. The Japanese kept detailed records of the prisoners. They documented Louis's name, his service number, his background. They knew exactly who he was. They knew what he represented. And they continued to abuse him, trying to break the symbol of American pride. But they failed. No matter what they did to him, Louis refused to be broken. Then, in August 1945, everything changed. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. After nearly 2 years of captivity, during which he endured starvation, disease, and constant brutality, Louis was finally liberated. American soldiers found the camps and freed the prisoners. When Louis was released, he weighed 90 pounds. He could barely walk. His body was ravaged, but he was alive. He had survived the ocean. He had survived captivity. He had survived the Bird and all the horrors, or so he thought. Louis returned to America a physical survivor, but a psychological casualty. He had endured 2 years of trauma on a scale that most people cannot imagine. While his body could begin to heal with proper nutrition and medical care, his mind was far more damaged. At night, Louis was plagued by nightmares. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, believing he was back in the camp. Every loud noise made him jump. Crowded places made him anxious. He was hypervigilant, always on edge, always expecting danger. This condition would later be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though in 1945 there was no such official diagnosis, veterans were simply expected to move on with their lives. Louis tried to return to competitive running. Surely, he thought, if he could return to the sport he loved, he could reclaim his life. But his body, weakened by captivity and malnutrition, couldn't perform. The runner who had competed in the Olympics could barely run anymore. This failure only deepened his despair. Louis began to drink. Alcohol became his escape, a way to quiet the voices in his head, to numb the memories, to sleep without nightmares. He drank in the mornings. He drank in the evenings. He drank whenever the memories threatened to overwhelm him. Alcoholism consumed his life, much as the war had consumed it before. His relationships suffered. He struggled to connect with people. He was irritable, angry, unpredictable. He couldn't explain to others what he had endured. How could he make someone understand what it felt like to be starved, beaten, humiliated, day after day? How could he bridge the gap between his experience and the normal life everyone else seemed to be living? Louis had a girlfriend named Cynthia Applewhite, but even that relationship was strained. Cynthia cared for Louis, but his behavior made it difficult. His drinking, his anger, his nightmares. There were times when Louis seemed to be a stranger, a dark and angry version of the man she had known. For years, Louis spiraled. He was a survivor in the physical sense, but spiritually and psychologically, he was drowning. He had defeated hunger, thirst, sharks, and brutality. But he seemed unable to defeat the demons in his own mind. Friends and family watched, helpless, as this former Olympic athlete and war hero slowly destroyed himself. They didn't know how to help. No one knew how to help. Louis didn't know how to help himself. He was trapped in a prison of his own trauma, as surely as he had once been trapped in the camps. Then, in 1949, something extraordinary happened. Louis attended a Christian revival meeting, led by a young evangelist named Billy Graham. Graham was known for his powerful preaching and his ability to move people to deep spiritual awakening. Louis, desperate and broken, sat in the audience. As Billy Graham spoke, something inside Louis shifted. Graham talked about forgiveness, about redemption, about the possibility of transformation through faith. Louis found himself moved to tears. He felt for the first time in years a sense of hope. He felt the possibility that he could be healed, not just physically, but spiritually and psychologically. At the conclusion of the service, Louis made a decision. He walked forward and committed his life to Christ. In that moment, he felt the weight of his trauma lift, his anger, his despair. It wasn't instantaneous healing. His demons didn't disappear overnight, but something fundamental shifted. Louis felt that he could be redeemed. In the years that followed, Louis became a devout Christian. But more than that, he came to understand something profound. He needed to forgive, not just others, but himself. And more remarkably, he needed to forgive his captors, particularly the bird, the guard who had subjected him to such brutal treatment. Forgiveness is easy to talk about in the abstract. It's much harder when you're being asked to forgive someone who tortured you. But Louis worked through his pain. He came to understand that holding on to hatred and anger was only harming himself. The bird had already stolen nearly 2 years of his life. Louis refused to let him steal the rest of it. Louis wrote a letter to the bird, expressing his forgiveness. The letter never reached its intended recipient. The bird had committed suicide years earlier, consumed by guilt over his own war crimes. But the act of writing the letter, of choosing forgiveness over vengeance, transformed Louis's life. With faith as his foundation and forgiveness as his guide, Louis began to heal. He gave up drinking. He reconnected with Cynthia, and they married. Together they built a life grounded in faith and purpose. Louis began speaking publicly about his experiences. He traveled to schools and churches, telling his story to anyone who would listen. His message was consistent. No matter how far you fall, redemption is possible. No matter how terrible your suffering, forgiveness and faith can transform you. Louis became a beacon of hope for other veterans struggling with trauma, for young people facing their own demons, for anyone who had experienced deep suffering. Louis didn't just talk about forgiveness. He lived it. He worked with troubled youth, mentoring them, believing in their capacity for change, just as his brother Pete had once believed in him. He saw in them the same wild energy he had possessed as a boy, and he channeled that energy toward positive ends. Perhaps most remarkably, Louis eventually traveled to Japan. He met with former Japanese soldiers and guards. He spoke about his experiences and about forgiveness. In doing so, he became a bridge between nations, a symbol of reconciliation and healing. The boy who had been brutalized by the Japanese military became an ambassador of peace and understanding. In 1998, decades after his captivity, Louis was given an extraordinary honor. He was selected to carry the Olympic torch for the Winter Olympics in Nagano, Japan. Can you imagine that? The American runner who had been tortured by the Japanese military was now running through Japan, carrying the torch of peace and international unity. As Louis ran with that torch, he was running on multiple levels. He was running as an athlete, as he had always done. He was running as a symbol of reconciliation between former enemies. But most importantly, he was running as a man who had been broken and had chosen to be healed. He was running as a testament to the human capacity for forgiveness and redemption. Louis' story eventually came to widespread public attention when author Laura Hillenbrand published Unbroken, a best-selling biography chronicling his life. The book became an international sensation. It introduced millions of readers to Louis' extraordinary story. Later, a major motion picture based on the book brought his story to even more people. But Louis never became consumed by celebrity. He remained humble, grounded, focused on his faith and his mission to help others. He continued speaking to audiences about his experiences. He continued mentoring young people. He continued to live out the principles of forgiveness and redemption that had saved his life. Louis lived to the age of 97. He passed away in 2014, leaving behind an incredible legacy. But what was his legacy, really? It wasn't the Olympic medal. He had competed but not won. It wasn't the survival of the plane crash and the Pacific ordeal, remarkable as that was. His true legacy was the transformation he underwent. and the message he carried to the world. The human spirit is capable of enduring almost anything, and forgiveness and faith have the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Louis's story teaches us that we are not defined by our trauma. We are not defined by our suffering. We are defined by how we choose to respond to that suffering. Louis chose resilience over despair. He chose forgiveness over hatred. He chose to use his suffering as a platform to help others, rather than as an excuse to remain broken. In the end, Louis Zamperini proved something essential. The troublemaker from Torrance, the Olympic runner, the war hero, the prisoner, the broken man, and finally the healed soul, proved that redemption is always possible. No matter where you come from, no matter what you've endured, no matter how lost you feel, there is always a path back. Back to wholeness, back to purpose, back to peace. His story reminds us that an unbroken spirit is the greatest victory of all.